Welcome to the Light Reading Podcast. This is Phil Harvey. I'm an editor here at Light Reading, and I'm joined on the podcast today by Kelsey Zeiser, my Light Reading colleague and fellow editor. Our guest today is a frequent Light Reading guest, Nick Feamster. He's a Neubauer professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago. He's also the director of the Center for Data and Computing at the University of Chicago. And on this show, we'll talk about how online learning is different for instructors and students, but certainly not an insurmountable task. Nick will also give us some updates on two academic research areas that he's involved in. First, we talk about the pandemic's effect on service provider networks from a technical point of view. Second, we talk about the challenges of getting broadband access to underserved communities. In a previous podcast, we talked about rural America and rural communities. In this one, we're going to talk more about underserved, so urban areas that maybe just don't have great infrastructure, or for whatever reason, there's a wide group of people that haven't signed up for broadband access and don't have adequate broadband access to do the things that we need to do, especially during the pandemic, like go to school and look for work and fill out government paperwork, register to vote, things like that. So we'll talk about all of those things. We'll wrap up by having Nick give some advice to anyone that's holding an online meeting, an online class, or a virtual event. He's been doing this a while, so you will want to take note of the tips he's going to be putting out there. Special thanks to Avast for sponsoring today's podcast, and we will get to the great Nick Feamster right after this break. This episode is brought to you by Avast, global leaders in digital security for network operators. They can build a safer digital world for your customers and their families. Discover more at avast.com/partners. That's avast.com/partners. Welcome to the Light Reading Podcast. I'm Phil Harvey. I'm an editor here at Light Reading. Joined as ever by Kelsey Zeiser, our the Light Reading Podcast co-host and keeper of the schedule, something that has become increasingly challenging in these pandemic times. But how you doing, Kelsey?
Good. Got all these, papers and files for our schedule.
I see the ongoing invites that will appear and then reappear and then disappear again, in different calendars. So
It's like
I
magic.
know somewhere she's hard at work. Let's see. So joining us today from University of Chicago, a frequent, I say frequent for us, a frequent podcast guest, Professor Nick Feamster from the University of Chicago. Hi, Nick. How are you?
Hi, Phil. It's great to be back with you and Kelsey.
Good to have you back.
Thanks for being on.
Yeah.
I guess the first question is, since we last talked, we spoke in May, and now classes are just starting up in most of the country for back to school. But I think you've already been doing some teaching. So, are you teaching online, or are you teaching in person, or a little bit of both, or do you write people really long letters? How have you been doing things?
All of the above, I guess you could say. I think there hasn't been a lot of on-campus teaching, and I think that's as a general matter, I think that's likely to continue through fall quarter. I think officially, U Chicago is doing the so-called hybrid mode, where students are coming back to campus in some form. But that's a rapidly evolving situation, and speaking from me personally, the vast majority of my instruction and interaction with students has been and will continue to be online. In fact, U Chicago it has an interesting academic schedule. It's on quarters as opposed to maybe a more conventional semester system, and so our spring quarter started. And it starts late. So our spring quarter actually started was supposed to start the last week of March, and it ended up starting the first week of April to give people more time to move their courses online.
Hmm.
So actually, as a faculty member at the University of Chicago, I've actually already had a full quarter of online teaching, and so have a fair bit of experience doing that now in a classroom setting. I've done it quite a bit in the context of massive open online courses and online degree programs in professional ed before, but this was the first time doing it in, taking a traditional classroom setting and moving it online. So that was a new experience for me.
Yeah, in your in a post you put on Medium a while back, you were talking about the difference and sort of the similarities between different types of online learning environments. So I like, what was the phrase you used? Massive open online course. What's sort of help us understand, like, what's the difference between that and like a traditional, what my son is going through, a traditional Zoom classroom call.
Right. So we use this massive open online course moniker. Many people may know of those as MOOCs, but by and large, they're not degree granting institutions like a university or a college. You might get a certification of some kind, or you might just get a certificate for having completed a course, or you might just get a pat on the back and some additional knowledge. And so the experience obviously is and the expectation for a product is actually a little bit different than, say, what your son might be going through, where you might be paying a full freight university tuition, and even if for those folks who aren't, like if they're getting a reduced tuition, if they're doing an online master's degree, which aren't new, you're still paying tuition. They expect some kind of experience that is, I'll say, at least as good as, if not better. I can say that it's different, but the goal is to make it at least as good. And I
Hmm.
do think that that's possible, but it certainly requires thinking about your instruction in a very different way, because it's not the same as, you can't just take a classroom and move it online and expect the same thing. A lot of modes
Hmm.
of instruction and a lot of modes of interaction really need to adapt to a very different setting.
Yeah, definitely.
So, looking back at your study results that we spoke about in May, what are some changes there in terms of the impact that the pandemic has made both on internet traffic volume as well as network performance? Have you seen any new surprising data there?
Perhaps the most surprising result or observation in all of this, as far as internet performance is concerned, is that there were no surprises. In other words,
That's funny.
by and large, things were fine. And to the extent that there's anything anomalous or interesting going on, they are true anomalies. And I think that's testament to a couple of things. One is the design of the internet as a packet switch network that, as opposed to sort of having fixed resource allocations for each one of us or each device, and setup of circuit-based communication like used to exist when we picked up an old school phone.
Yeah.
The internet's basically core design is to adapt to fluctuations in load, to failures of individual components, and so forth. And so part of the resilience is really a testament to the original design. The other, I think, aspect of resilience is a testament to the internet service providers and the content providers who have provisioned the infrastructure in such a way that it can absorb essentially pretty substantial shocks to traffic demand.
Yeah, it's interesting because the tendency for a lot of especially telco networks, who are also internet service providers, was to build things with the kind of worst case scenario in mind. So they were always building for that peak load traffic, Netflix on a Friday night type of
Right.
thing. And interestingly, because they were building for that and it wasn't all completely spun up on demand, when the traffic load that hit the Netflix at Friday night became also Netflix on Monday morning and Tuesday afternoon and so on and so forth, they actually seemed to weather the storm quite well. And now I think they're looking at ways to maybe adjust capacity, you know, to have their networks be even more flexible, like all year long, as opposed to having to
That's right.
build in, I guess, extra capacity.
That's right. I think, and I can mention a few specifics there too. But I think,
Sure.
in a general sense, um, we have you know, the congestion days of 2014 to thank for the preparedness of the internet infrastructure for these kinds of systemic shocks. Because, if you recall, that was when Netflix traffic and other video traffic saw a huge spike in demand, and that created the types of surges that you were talking about. And of course, there needed to be some reaction to that in terms of adding capacity to the network. Not only adding it, but continually adding it, right, to keep pace with the growth, because the internet, demand for video streaming has continued to grow.
So it sounds like in some ways we can thank Netflix for preparing us for the pandemic.
In a way, the
Indirectly.
meltdown that they were largely responsible for, 6 or 7 years ago, has
Yeah.
caused has caused the need to stay ahead of those kinds of demands. And I think the other thing that I think, Phil, you had mentioned was that
Hmm.
some of it was sort of an increase in demand, but the other thing was basically just that peak has become all day long,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so, in
So
some
we're on a
sense,
plateau now, I guess.
right? In some sense, that's it's an interesting shift, but it doesn't like fundamentally change. Um, it doesn't fundamentally change capacity planning.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, it changes traffic engineering and traffic management practices potentially, but in terms of like how much capacity you need to allocate on an interconnect,
Mhm.
you're going to be allocating for peak anyway. And
Mhm.
so, if peak is 7 to 10 p.m. On a Friday night, or if peak is 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. all week long, in some sense, that's more of a minor adjustment than a wholesale re-architecting of the network.
Right.
Um, of course, I'm simplifying a little bit, because I'm sure
Mhm.
any network operator listening to this is like, "Yeah, come on, I wasn't sleeping for for months." But we had to think about how to handle that load. But it was not, let's burn it all down and rebuild. This is not working, right?
Well, and the best possible news was that from the consumer side, it was barely perceptible in most cases. Like if you
Mhm.
already had a really robust internet connection and
Yeah,
you were already used to, doing conference calls at home or whatever, it you really didn't notice anything except that your monthly traffic usage went way, way, way up. And,
that's right.
of course, you could talk to your ISP about whether they were going to politely ignore that for a couple of months until you sorted it out or whatever.
I think one of the things that we are now studying, that certainly bears more examination, is what exactly is going on with upstream traffic out of the
Mhm.
access networks. And that's a project that we're just now starting. We have a little bit of support from Comcast to look um, at that specific question, like what's going on with traffic ratios now that people are sitting in their homes streaming video out of the home all day, because that is different, right? And I think, you know empirically and anecdotally speaking, we all seem to be holding up fairly well. That I mean, I should say that the ISPs seem to be holding up fairly well, but that's a fairly fundamental shift in terms of traffic symmetry. And it is probably something that I imagine that the especially cable ISPs are thinking about, because historically, um, cable access and DOCSIS has allocated bandwidth in an asymmetric fashion under the assumption that we're at home primarily consumers of content. And so, there may be some interesting things to follow up on there. I suspect, as has been the case with everything else, that there are no catastrophes because we're not observing them. But there may be interesting questions related to provisioning, right? What does this mean going forward for provisioning a DOCSIS access network if we can no longer assume a certain traffic ratio, based on Netflix and YouTube consumption, and now application traffic mixes have shifted to Zoom and Teams and Meet.
Yeah. Well, it'd be interesting to follow up with you on that later, once you have more data. Also wanted to ask you about how internet traffic is potentially changing in rural or historically underserved areas. I imagine that, schools have had to be kind of creative in providing Wi-Fi or hotspots for students in remote areas. Are you looking into that at all?
Kelsey, that's a really timely and apt question, and an extremely complicated one, that I think some of it goes outside of my historical expertise. Some of it might even go out beyond the scope of the Light Reading podcast. But that's exactly why I'm so excited to work on it, is to actually learn a little bit more about that. So, let me sort of talk about that a little bit. Historically, we've been really concerned with things like speed testing, right? To put it in sort of a crude form, am I getting what I'm paying for from my ISP, right? And we run speed tests and so on and so forth to figure that out. Okay, well, that's one question, but that's a pretty narrow part of the bigger picture. Moving up from that, we have questions of application performance. Is the product, if I may, right? Is what my ISP providing me, is that good enough to do the things that I need to do? Now, the question that you posed about access is multifaceted, right? Because there's a sort of surface level version of that question, which is, who has internet access in different regions, and who doesn't have access. But then there's a really sort of very complicated, multifaceted aspect to that question, which is, for those people who don't have access, why? And it's not always the case that someone doesn't have access because the ISP isn't providing it to that block, right? Or to their house. Maybe it's a question of affordability. Maybe it's a question of a perceived need. Maybe it's a question of sometimes there are other social questions, just past unpaid bills, so on and so forth. You started off with, are you looking into these kinds of questions? And yes, we are. So I am working with some collaborators in other departments at University of Chicago, in particular, Professor Nicole Marwell, who works in the Social Service Administration School at University of Chicago. She works on things that relate to community resilience and engagement. And also I'm working with another researcher, Elaine Allensworth, who is the director of the Consortium on Chicago Schools. And she looks at education and sort of what, how can we sort of track and understand student engagement and outcomes, among other things? Because on the very, very far end, on the things that I've spent 10 years of my career looking at, we have how fast can you push bits across the access link, and on the way other far end, we have our students who are Zooming from home, learning what they need to learn this school year, and it's going to be an interesting process. But we are working with partners in the city of Chicago and the Chicago Connected Initiative as part of the city initiative to connect 60,000 CPS households across the city to better understand some of these questions.
Oh, that is interesting. So, uh, no, it's also interesting to kind of draw a bit of an underline between, rural and underserved, because like you were alluding to earlier, um, there's definitely those situations where people just live, in locations that are hard to reach. And of course the
Mhm.
ISP can't get all the way out there. And on light reading, we're covering things like low Earth orbit satellites and other novel ways of reaching different populations. But underserved is definitely, um, suffers the same, if, after effects of, not being able to get to online school and uh, things like that. But
Yeah.
but the causes are so much different, and I assume that some of the solutions are a little bit different too, in terms of how cities and municipalities can maybe, uh, uh, like you said, ask the right questions and maybe figure out how to better serve those populations.
That's right, and that's an area where I'm not an expert, but my collaborator Nicole Marwell, she studies exactly those kinds of questions, and because you can make an investment in a community potentially, right? Like let's build out internet access to that community, or let's
Hmm.
subsidize subscriptions to ISP.
Yeah, I wish I was more of like you said, this definitely is out. We're definitely out of our comfort zone here, but
Yeah,
I'm fascinated with this idea of um, using some of the both city and telco and sort
yeah,
of hard infrastructure that we already have, like libraries, to
yeah,
better serve these areas. Because it is interesting to me that, um, you know that that the library system in a lot of cities, if you were to like look at it from a topographical point of view, it's not a bad way to reach just about everybody with some form of wireless access. If you sort of reimagined it as pieces of a network, it would actually be, some city libraries and city buildings are extremely well placed for that sort of thing.
Mhm.
You're absolutely right, Phil, and certainly I think a lot of cities are thinking hard about how the library infrastructure and also how the public school infrastructure can provide anchors for connectivity. But also there are security and privacy and also public safety concerns with using those uh, anchors as internet access attachment points. To give you a sense of that, um, an open Wi-Fi network, um, let's say at a public school, right? Um, okay, just pointing the antennas, like turning them out, into the open from the build. It seems like, well, why not? Like, let's just do that. That makes sense. Then people can use that resource, right? Now, on the other hand, what you have created in doing that is a point of congregation, and in
Right. Yeah.
um, in some urban settings, doing that creates public safety concerns potentially.
Yeah, no, boy, that's an excellent point. And yeah, so before we get too far to the edges of my grasp on things, I definitely like, though. Well, it's definitely something I encourage our audience to look into as well. It's like, what is your community doing? What is your municipality doing locally to help? Because no matter how urban or rural your locale, there's definitely people that are underserved, and there's definitely
Mhm.
people that need to find internet access in order to
Yeah,
participate in school, to file for unemployment or
Mhm.
benefits of some sort, to get their medications, because now most of the medications are being done via online pharmacies and online refill systems. Especially in a pandemic, you don't want to be queued up in line all day and that sort of thing. So I'll just leave it there with that bit of advice. But
yeah.
Nick, before we let you go, um, since you are, if I may, an old hand at this, what advice do you have for, perhaps someone who has to teach an online class or hold some sort of, whether it's academic or not, even if it's in the business world, holding some sort of online, doing some sort of online teaching or addressing an audience. What do you have any advice for people doing that for the first time, or something they should be keeping in mind if they're somewhat new at this?
Absolutely. And Phil, I'm glad you mentioned, the business world or meetings as well as sort of another facet of this.
Yeah.
Because I think the advice that I'll offer applies not only to online teaching, but also just to the way that we interact with each other in the workplace now. And I think the single biggest thing that I would keep in mind is that the modes of engagement that work well in an environment that is primarily face-to-face may not be the right modes of engagement if you just move them online, right? So to give
Right.
two
Yeah.
examples, right? In a classroom setting where I see the students face-to-face, it might make sense for me to stand up in front of the class and lecture to a whiteboard, and I can read the room, right? I can take questions. I can, it's the equivalent to Broadway theater or something versus a movie, right, or a TV show or a radio show.
I just had
Do you
an
break
image
into
of you on
song
Broadway.
much during your class?
And
Hello,
no
Miss
song and
Simon.
dance in mine, unfortunately. But there's a tendency, I think, and I've observed it with some instructors, to basically, I'm just going to take my lecture and like do it on Zoom, and that's not it, guys. That is definitely not it. I mean, who among us enjoys sitting through 80 minutes of Zoom? Not me.
No,
and so
definitely not.
forget about it. And so that's one, so you can kind of read my Medium post as well, but I completely changed the mode of engagement, right? First of all, I turned a significant fraction of the course into asynchronous engagement. So recorded videos, and by the way, short recorded videos. So I broke up lecture content into short, 5 to 10 minute segments, where, by the way, it's asynchronous. If you want to play it at 2x, that's fine. I won't be offended. If if you want to play it at half x, that's, if you want to watch it 3 times. So some students actually like that better, right? And then anything that was synchronous, I actually kept pretty short as well. And then I basically did moderated interactive Q&A because, again, it's sitting in front of a Zoom screen is just, it's not sustainable. And so what I wanted to do is make the most of the online, synchronous experience by making it as interactive as possible. And that took some organization. There's a little bit in the, in the Medium post where I describe how I organize that. But the high level comment there is that it really requires a complete rethinking of how you're going to basically spend people's time and how you're going to engage. Because you can't just take what worked in the face-to-face setting and just like shift it to Zoom. That doesn't work. I'll give you one more example because it's kind of a funny one. You asked about the business world, right? So meetings, right? Probably you can relate to this. I think probably maybe most of our listeners can relate. We used to have these things called lunch meetings, right? Where, we'd cater some lunch and we'd all sit around and, have a meeting. Maybe there'd be an agenda at some point. We'd get something done. Maybe we wouldn't, but at least we got a free lunch. Sure. And, I noticed some of these lunch meetings that I used to have shifting to Zoom. And, suddenly I don't want to be, not only do I not want to be eating in front of Zoom, but also I've got kids at home that need to eat at the same time. And so suddenly something that was super duper convenient in a business setting, right? Or in a real world setting. Cause it's like, cool. Even if the meeting is useless, like I got a free lunch.
Got these chips. Yeah.
Yeah. The cake was good. Right. But now the lunch meeting becomes this huge inconvenience. Right. And so, Even in my workplace, I've suggested that we move meetings away from lunch to allow for a break from the screen, to allow for us to feed the kids, and so forth. So I think basically, coming back to the main point, you asked about advice. You have to rethink everything that worked well in the real world setting, because just simply transferring it online is in many cases not likely to be the right answer.
Yeah, great advice, because that's what, and I know we're early days into a lot of companies being forced to figure this out with a lot of the things that they do, but that's we still see an awful lot of that, and it just makes things a little bit worse when they don't really consider what their audience is maybe going through or having to deal with.
I mean, especially if you're trying to help, do your own work and then help your kids on their Zoom calls. And then on top of that, you have to stay on for lunch like that and make your own cake.
It's a bit much.
Absolutely.
Well, we'll definitely link to your Medium post on online courses in our show notes. And once again, Nick Feamster, thanks so much for taking the time. We do appreciate it.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Kelsey. And I hope to be back soon talking more about what we've learned in some of these ongoing studies.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Nick.
That is it. That's our show. This podcast is produced by the Light Reading Video team, Tien Fu and Pierre Landrio. Thank you, boys, for doing what you do. We do appreciate it. You will find this and all of our other past episodes by visiting www.lightreading.com/LRpod. That's lightreading.com/LRpod. Or you can subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcasting app. Overcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, SoundCloud, etc., etc. Thank you very much for listening to the Light Reading Podcast. Thanks to Avast for their sponsorship this week. Avast's award-winning security solutions make it easy for your customers to stay safe online, no matter how many devices they use. Learn more at avast.com/partners. That's avast.com/partners.